We'll now turn to Tom Marois, who is speaking partly from his dissertation research, as I was mentioning, on bank privatizations in Mexico and Turkey.
Thanks, Greg. I have about 10 minutes, so it's almost going to be like an advertisement, as one of my friends said. So I'm going to try to get to the issue of specifically the internalization of foreign bank capital in Mexico and what that means in the current conjuncture of the Calderon government and what possible alternatives, how can we imagine finally. I have a couple specific arguments I'm going to put right up front, and then if we can get to them, hopefully we can, because I don't want to go over my time limit so we can have more of a discussion. What I argue, though, is that the internationalization of foreign bank capital has subjected both the Calderon government and the Mexican political economy more directly to the sort of competitive imperatives of finance-led accumulation since the 1980s. Now, as a form of discipline, this has restricted the legitimate options of both the government and also social actors of all varieties in Mexico. And it represents the solidification of 3 years of neoliberal reform, three decades, of class reformation and state reformation in Mexico. Now, I'm looking at specifically from the vantage point of banking. Now, these changes can be traced back to the 1982 nationalization of the banks, or statization, and then subsequent 1990-92 privatizations. And I'm going to touch on that briefly just as a history, and then get to the current conjuncture. So historically, Mexico has had a bank-based system where bank capital has had very privileged position within the power block, within the government, within the political economy in general. Positions on the central banks, links to the PRI, and then state managers who work in the financial sector in the government typically return back to the financial sector as private sector high-level managers. The commercial banks are important to the large family-based holding groups in Mexico, or have been historically. Somewhat very similar to Ilfrey's case of finance capital, where it's at the center of commercial holding groups. Bank labor has historically been actually accepted compromises from the mid-1930s and recently. Banking flows of capital in Mexico has been a very regional concentration where it's almost entirely dominated in Mexico City, secondary by the north of Monterrey, third by Guadalajara, and then followed fourth by Veracruz. The banks typically draw resources from resource-poor areas and draw them into the resource-rich, meaning they pull from agricultural and rural sections to feed the industrial and urban sectors of Mexico within the three concentrated regions. Now, this represents overall a tendency towards centralization and the concentration of banking capital in Mexico. In terms of the number of institutions, you look at the 1950s, there was over 380 banks. Early 1980s, before the statization of the banks, you're looking at about 60. During the period of state ownership, those were concentrated down to about 18. And now, although there's more institutions, perhaps 30 banks, they're dominated by a handful, maybe 5 foreign banks that carry, I think, I'll get to the numbers later, but about 60% of the assets in 3 banks, foreign owned. Now, I'm just going to, the history, I'm going to give you more of the thesis and the details. Now, when you look at the 1982 bank statization, what I argue is that this had the unintended consequence of enabling a more rapid transition to neoliberalism and financialization in Mexico. Why I argue that is because López Portillo statized the banks in order to rescue the state-led. The subsequent president, de la Madrid, then used those banks to usher in very rapid financial reforms, use the state banks to enable wider privatizations, and then even the payment for the banks were funneled back into the privatization project of Mexico during the 1980s and opened it up. In the process, they restructured the banks, beginning with moving from 60 banks to 18, and reorganized them on a regional basis in terms of how to facilitate capital accumulation on the neoliberal model. At the same time, he pursued a whole series of financial liberalization measures, notably 1989 capital account liberalization. Now, bank privatization happened very rapidly from 1990 to 1992, and this is really the basis of following crisis, which leads into the internalization of bank capital, foreign bank capital. Now, the banks were sold to domestic capital. Some were the old bankers, some were new financial neobanqueros, the financial elite in Mexico, who made their money off privatizations. It was a structural shift from state-controlled banking, which had been from 82 to 92, to entirely private and domestic-owned. At that time, the government guaranteed profitability through a sort of differential between the amount they paid on savings and the amount they would get on loaning out money. Now, to give you a sense of the privatization itself, within the 2 years, it earned $12.5 billion on the banks alone. Contextually, of a combined $96 million in all third world privatizations from 1988 to 93, Mexican privatizations overall accounted for $25 million. So the bank privatizations were half of that, or equal to 13% of all third world privatizations from 1988 to 1993. To give you a sense of how massive a structural shift it was in banking. Again, contextually, 2001, Banamex, one of the largest banks, was sold to Citibank for $12.5 billion. So then you see also the massive speculative increase in the price of what the worth of one bank was, and they sold off the whole system for that amount. Now, everybody's, I'm sure, to some extent familiar with the 94 to 96 banking crisis, so I'm not going to get into it. But what James Cipher argues is that the market-led reforms, developments since 1980s encouraged a fictitious economic expansion and created structural volatility by the early 1990s, which was fed by globally liquid capital and internalized through massive loans taken by the newly privatized banks. And to an extent, this was the basis of the banking crisis, was the massive loans that took lending them out, speculation, etc. Now, the state came to the rescue of the banks, and by February 1998, they estimated that the cost of the banking rescue was about $60 billion, taken on by the state insurance fund, FOBA-PRO, for banks. They tried to legitimize the rescue in 1998, came to a soft compromise of including the cost of it in the annual budget. By 2000, the cost continues to rise, and it's about $100 billion, or 20% of the GDP of 2000 in Mexico is the cost of it. Now, the importance of the crisis, because this, to some extent, enabled the internalization of foreign bank capital. Because contrary to what you might believe during NAFTA negotiations, there was a provision put in to sort of hold off on the foreign banks coming in, foreign bank capital coming into Mexico. Those had to be rescinded with the crisis to bolster the system, sort of stabilize it. So in 1995, the government allowed in foreign capital. By 1999, all restrictions on foreign bank capital had been removed. At the time of NAFTA, when they were thinking, of liberalizing, they were in the process of liberalizing finance. They believed that by 1996, they were looking at perhaps 9% foreign ownership, and then by 1999, 15%. So in 2002, according to the Bank of International Settlements, their estimates, that foreign ownership was 82% of control of the banking system. It's actually about 85% currently, with domestic private banks controlling 18%, and state banks are completely removed at this point. So it's complete domination. 85% of the entry of foreign bank capital occurred from 2000 to 2002. So it was also, again, very rapid inflows of foreign bank capital and taking over of the sector. It is the largest share of foreign bank ownership in any of the Latin American countries at 85%.